Everyone. We're so happy that you joined us on this pleasant evening. Welcome to another exciting and enlightening UPF webinar, which is part of our Great Enrichment series. We have a special guest today, Brad Gooch, and we have Daniel, who is, of course, mashallah, very well versed in all of these topics. So there you go. Welcome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Shaista. Welcome to everyone, and salam to everyone that's joining us. I think we'll start on time this evening. We have a very exciting program from somebody who is an author that actually has been working, I just learned, on Muslim issues for many, many years, and issues of spirituality and even really in the Islamic faith as well. But Brad Gooch is a writer based in the New York area. And we learned of him because of our latest film project, Lamya's poem. And we're really looking for someone that could, or a book that could highlight and illuminate the part of Rumi's life that the film was trying to portray, which was the youth, the Rumi as a young boy. And so Rumi's Secret, the life of the Sufi poet of love, which serendipitously came out, I think, just a couple of years ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, but still feels very fresh, is still being talked about a lot. Brad Gooch has actually won several awards for his books on Flannery Connor. He's written a book on the New York School of Poets, one of my personal favorite poets. So Brad has a lot of very interesting projects. For Rumi's Secret, Brad traveled in the footsteps of Rumi. I guess, Brad, it would be interesting to make a documentary of your project. But not only did you do that, you also immersed yourself in the Persian language. And one of the things we're going to talk about later that I find very important is the fact that this figure of Rumi, who is the most purchased poet in the United States, is now undergoing a kind of renaissance from the standpoint of Persian and Islamic scholarship. So for our mission at UPF, which is to tell the Muslim story, to tell the American Muslim story through film, that's kind of a blessing. And so relying on Brad's guidance, because Brad's research is really a part of this Rumi renaissance, given that you worked with Persian specialists in creating the translations, all of that is very much in line with how we want to portray Rumi in our film. So we're very grateful for your consultation. I guess my first question, Brad, and thank you for being with us on this webinar, is can you tell us a little bit about what got you interested in religion and spirituality as a writer?
Well, first, thanks for having me. And I think I was always interested. I grew up in the suburbs in the 1950s and 60s. And at that point, and my parents was a very secular sort of background, so that religion wasn't a big part of our lives particularly. And actually, so it had this reverse effect on me. But when I became a teenager, then I sort of became interested in all religions at once. I mean, for a while I wanted to be a Trappist monk and sort of explored that. And then later, I wrote a book called God Talk, Travels in Spiritual America, which was basically trying to still explore these different traditions within America in a reportorial way. And the last chapter in that book was called Muslims in New York City. And I was already familiar with Rumi as a poet. I think most people come to Rumi because of those seductive, wonderful poems. And I had read those, and then at a certain point, translations of Coleman Barks came out that became, when you talk about best-selling poet in America, it was those translations. And I remember one Christmas season I got, when the book first came out, 3 separate people sent me the Essential Rumi, the new translations of him. But when I was done working on this chapter on Muslims in New York City, as part of that, I reported on and joined a Sufi group that was meeting on the Upper West Side, Manhattan, with Imam Faisal Rauf. This was before 9/11, before he became more famous, notorious with the Ground Zero controversy. And it was really a group of young Muslim Americans, mostly in their 20s and 30s, who would come together in the living room of Imam Faisal and Daisy Khan, his wife, every Friday night, and do Sufi practice. And Faisal's main person, in a way, was Rumi, but not so much the Rumi of the lyric poems that I've been reading and that were so popular, but the Rumi as a spiritual religious leader, and reading from his talks and lectures that had been written down by his students. And so between the emphasis on this other dimension of Rumi, which was being ignored a little bit in the sort of Rumi poetry craze at the time, and also the people in the group were from both Sunni and Shia traditions. They were from Europe, the Middle East, Turkey, Central Asia, Canada, America, and I just heard bit by bit pieces of the life of Rumi, sort of also pieced together in my mind the geography, and just became interested in doing a book about Rumi, because also at that time it seemed that Rumi was a name without an identity. I mean, almost like a brand in a way. I mean, people knew who Rumi was, but at the same time, I talked about in my book, I talked to a couple who had Rumi read at their wedding, and they thought that he was Buddhist. So people had no real sense of the true life and context of Rumi, and that's really what moved me to want to start this book. I mentioned 9/11. I mean, what the book I was writing, I was researching before. It came out in 2002, and for a while, publishers were nervous about doing a biography of a Muslim figure like Rumi. That went on for a couple of years, and then it flipped at some point where they became very interested. So project has been going on for a while, and eventually I got to do it.
So first of all, I think it's very admirable that you went and you learned Persian and you did the work, you rolled up your sleeves. And so talk about that, but also talk about what it required from the standpoint of travel.
Right.
Because in the book, I mean, as we'll get to in a moment, Rumi led a very nomadic life amidst, chaos and war, and profound social and political instability, much like our own times, maybe. But yeah, what was the prep like? Now, that's very helpful background to learn about how you learned about Rumi, which is very different than how most Americans learn about Rumi. Usually it's a Hallmark card. You actually learned by being a part of a Sufi practice. I had no idea about that. That's fascinating. But how did you prep yourself to write this book?
After I happily signed a contract to write the book, then I realized there were some things maybe I hadn't thoroughly thought through, which is one was, learning Persian to be able to read the poetry. And I originally had a tutor, Mariam Mortaz, who's an Iranian-American writer. And she then went on, her role was sort of grew from tutor to collaborator in translating. First the parts that we used in the book, and then for a volume of mostly untranslated Rumi poems we did later called Unseen Poems. But besides that, I also, I'd studied in intensive Persian programs the University of Texas in Austin, the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So that's where you live in a dorm, basically, and with other, mostly younger than me, students who were learning, in this case, Farsi, and you had to speak 24/7. I mean, that was the point of those. So that was part of learning the language, and then the travel. Luckily, there was a kind of window in that period where the world seemed to be opening up. I mean, this has changed radically since then, but in between 2010, 2016, pretty much. And I traveled first along the Silk Road on a tour that had been organized by Harvard University to Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan. I've been to Iran 3 times, and I was in Syria. I was actually in Aleppo the week that the Civil War broke out. So there are also, I mean, interestingly in this, I might have had some romantic, you mentioned Hallmark card, idea of this, beautiful Persian poet of love in the past. But actually I kept intersecting with a lot of realpolitik with this in writing this book.
And you referenced that in the introduction and the afterword as well.
Yeah,
the
exactly.
figure, Sebastian, who you meet. So that's very interesting because in Lamya's poem, which Brad actually read Alex's script of Lamya's poem, which we're making, and just as an update to you, Brad, this film has been selected to be screened at the Cannes Film Festival this year.
Fantastic, congratulations.
So yes, inshallah it goes well. Anyways, so let us pivot to this wonderful book. This is a book that I kind of picked and chose a couple of chapters to read a year ago, but then in preparation for this interview, I recently finished it. And bravo, it was a tour de force. I really felt like Rumi's world came alive for me. One of the really important themes is the relationship that Rumi had with his father, Baha'u'llah. And help us understand this figure who was a religious teacher in his own right, who was sort of appointed to a far-off region of an empire and wasn't quite maybe happy about that, but decided to sojourn from Balkh in Afghanistan, modern-day Afghanistan, all the way along the Silk Road to Baghdad, onward to Konya. That's an immense journey today. I mean, even then, I couldn't even imagine. You referenced that Rumi's brother may have died in this journey. So what was Baha'u'llah as an Islamic teacher, as a sort of father to Rumi? How did you find him?
Yeah, I mean, Rumi came from a religious family and a family of preachers and teachers. His grandfather had been a well-known preacher in Balkh, and his father then likewise in the smaller, probably the town of Baksh, at least for a while, in what's now Tajikistan. And he was a much more traditional religious teacher than Rumi turned out to be, although he certainly had sympathies with the mystical teachings broadly under the term Sufism. But it's interesting, we have journals of the father, and then when you actually, and he's been romanticized himself in a way, when you actually read the journals, they're more interesting because, as you were saying, he's actually annoyed that he hasn't been recognized in the way that he feels he should be. And that's, part of the story of his life. And then he leaves, he winds up in Konya much later, where he finally is recognized through accidents of history. But the journey that they take, I mean, it's a little unclear what begins this journey, and if it's simply Baha'u'llah in search of a more glamorous life, or post, or But along the way, they become part of, I mean, the big part of history at this point is that the Mongols under Genghis Khan invade and they wipe out what is the land of Rumi's birth. And these great cities of Balkh and Samarkand and Merv are destroyed. Some scholars think that there was a 90% genocide of Persians living in Central Asia at that time. So sometime around the time that Baha'u'llah and his family, including the boy Rumi, are in Mecca, you know, they find out that there's no way back if they had ever intended. So they sort of transform from being perhaps pilgrims to really being migrants in that way,
Yeah.
or refugees.
You find in the book so much attention to detail. And for example, when you talk about the father, you talk about the stacks of his books and how the Quran was always at the top, but how he read widely, and you say the same about. So how did you learn the details? There's so many fine details of their lives, given that we probably don't have too much, you know, written about Baha'u'llah, for example. How did you find the archive for that?
I mean, we have more than we think, I think. So as I said, Baha'u'llah, there was basically his diary, which exists, not in English, but in Persian, and, you know, with help and guidance, you can, one can get through it.
Yeah.
In terms of Rumi, it's interesting because I remember he was a public figure, very much so, and he was considered a saintly figure. And around him, the Mevlevi order of Sufism formed. So it really means that anything that we have letters of Rumi's. I mean, anything that Rumi wrote or touched, we have students' notes of his talks. And after his death, there was a book that was commissioned basically by Rumi's grandson to Aflaki to go around and interview all the people who had known Rumi, including his wife was still alive. I mean, this was very soon after. And people have sort of, and this has been translated into English, and people have sort of dismissed it over the years because it's filled with tales of Rumi turning into rose petals and teleporting to Mecca and returning in 5 minutes and things like that. And so people say, well, these are fairy tales and they're not helpful. But actually, I mean, it's very long. I mean, it's a book that's 800 pages.
Wow.
Lucky. And so my rule was just, if it's boring, it must be true. And there's a lot of boring detail in this about Konya and about Rumi reading by the light so late every night that his wife would become annoyed at him, and just the real details of life that haven't been picked up on that much. I mean, you can find out the name of all of Rumi's, many of Rumi's followers. You can figure out from that the street map of Konya where he was living. So it's very helpful.
Really great. I was struck by all of these wonderful vignettes. I mean, just for folks that haven't read the book or that are less familiar with Rumi's biography, the family sort of flees, as Brad said, it's ambiguous, the motivation of their fleeing, but largely having to do with the Mongol instability. But along the way, they perform the Hajj, and at the Hajj, there is a pretty legitimate assumption that Ibn Arabi, one of the most important mystics of the time, met or was arranged to have a meeting with Baha'u'llah, the father. And there's a narrated point, which is that as Ibn Arabi was leaving, he was so struck by this young boy who didn't have much articulation, but just his presence, his spiritual presence, that he said, you are a lake next to an ocean. I'm leaving, you know, you are a profound spiritual presence in your own right, but your son, just wait. But that's not the only time that people said that about Rumi. It's like his whole life was being prepped to be better than his father. Did you get that impression?
In a sense. I mean, it's interesting how much he revered his father. So none of the edges that we're talking about with Baha'u'llah were ever articulated by Rumi. I mean, he was very devoted to his father, and and basically was following in his father's footsteps until his 30s. I mean, he was studying very seriously to do exactly that, to take over his father's school, and he was studying in Damascus and in Aleppo. He was studying Sharia law and all kinds, I mean, a really serious scholarly sort of life that actually would prepare him for that. But at a certain point, then he goes beyond.
And what was that point? Was it the meeting of Shams of Tabrizi, or did it come elsewhere?
I think it was. There could have been hints before, but it was really the radical change that happened in his life when he met Shams of Tabrizi in 1244, and that they knew each other for 3.5 years. And if you're talking about the father, one thing about Shams, who becomes many things, but sort of a mentor and teacher of Rumi's, is to tell him that he's to stop reading his father's books. So he's trying to move him beyond. He's basically saying to him, you're more than that, or you're different than that, right? That you're really a poet and you're really a mystic, and that more so than a professor and a scholar. And this becomes the theme of Rumi's.
You make an excellent point that Imam al-Ghazali, before Rumi, a century before or so, had a similar break, really, to Rumi when Rumi met Shams, which was that, and you make the also beautiful point that al-Ghazali's brother was the true mystic, who Rumi looked up to even more in some ways,
right,
as a young boy. And I love that point. But they both had a breakdown. They had a spiritual, I don't know if we would call it that today, maybe a spiritual psychological breakdown in some way, right?
Yeah, I mean, in Rumi's case, it basically followed after his 3.5 years and with Shams, that Shams disappears. And this separation, Jodai, in Persian, title of the movie that won the Academy Award a few years ago, so this is still a concern in Persian culture. This separation is so painful for Rumi, and it's really out of that he becomes a mystic and also starts writing poetry. So all of these thousands of poems almost that we have of Rumi happen from his late 30s on. I mean, it's enough that he created as much that he did, but it was also in the second half of his life. And he made this transformation. I mean, he had the line about love stole my prayer beads and gave me poetry and song. And that's really it, the change from said I put up on the shelf the books and logic and learning, and in their places art and song and dance, the whirling dance that we so associate with Rumi, that he was mostly encouraged in doing by Shamsi Tabrizi.
And the secret in your title is also located in this motif of the pearl, and this kind of idea that the two spiritual masters, Shams and Rumi, had somehow found a way to generate this secret in spiritual practice, is my reading of it. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about what was the pearl? I mean, this is a thing we hear often, that you're diving for the pearl of great spiritual wisdom. This is a Rumi kind of motif that Shams brings to Rumi. But talk a little bit more, if you would, about this notion or motif of the pearl of wisdom. What is that?
Well, interestingly, you mentioned in passing earlier when I was in Aleppo, and one Friday morning, and bicycling up to me was this young guy, and I was trying to make a map of what Aleppo was like in Rumi's time, and kind of where we were. and he stopped and he said, "Are you a spy?" And and I said, "No, I'm writing about Rumi." And then he kind of started laughing. He thought he was kidding. And he said, "Oh, Rumi, I love Rumi." And he started reciting in English, in one of these classic translations by a Cambridge scholar, the beginning of the Masnavi. And before he left, he said, "You know, I love Rumi. He's like Shakespeare or your American poet Whitman. He never tells his secret." And then he bicycled off. You know, this was early enough in my trying to figure out what this book was about. It was before I was writing anything, and it stuck in my head that Rumi did have a secret, but what? And there seemed to have a few of them. You know, his personal life, his theology, his poetry, and what that was about. And then as I read more and more, and read more and more of the poetry, this word "ser," which is secret, comes up all the time. I mean, it's one of Rumi's main words. And he had you know, an attitude when you ask what is the pearl. Well, Rumi's not going to tell you in a definition. I mean, and that's why it's what's confusing about his poetry and also alluring about his poetry, is that you always kind of have to keep opposing ideas in your head at the same time.
Yeah.
Especially human love and divine love. The poems seem to be about both. And so the sense is always that, I mean, khamush, silence, is a big word in Rumi, often in the last line of some of his poems. And his sense is that a poem is successful when it falls apart, basically, and goes into pure silence.
Mm.
The Rumi's sense was always, you can't define these matters, but poetry kind of allows you to get closer to it.
Yeah. Before we end our conversation on how Shams kind of transformed Rumi's world in a similar way that Al-Ghazali had his spiritual epiphany, both of these spiritual epiphanies, by the way, led to the production of new books, which were their most important efforts. The revival of the religious sciences for Al-Ghazali, and then the Masnavi for Rumi, which I want to talk about. But I also love the fact that in your book you show the contradictory character of Shams, which is, on one hand, he's, you know, able to affiliate with people at the tavern and homeless people, and he can dance with anyone in the streets. On the other hand, he trains Rumi to bring everything back to the Prophet Muhammad. So he himself is, and he's very, I would say, intentionally inconsistent. Obviously, he disappears, but then he comes back. You know, so there's these very subtle. He's such a fascinating figure. Well, how do you see his influence on Rumi? Because in some ways, after he is finally gone, because he's many years older than Rumi, he's 60 and Rumi is in his 30s. Rumi becomes the full Maulana, right? Once he is over the mourning process of the absence. But how do you see Shams's real imprint on Rumi? It's so, I know there's much to be said, but maybe a couple of things.
Well, he certainly, yes, galvanized him and changed him. And you're right. I think if you were central casting, trying to come up with a spiritual leader to transform Rumi, you wouldn't come up with Shamsi Tabrizi, because he was, I mean, he was actually kind of misanthropic and cranky, and he would do things like try to charge Rumi's disciples to come and see Rumi. Like he'd sit outside the door and saying, "You have to pay me $5 to come see him." So he did things that were almost intentionally made people upset and annoyed. And also he disrupted this life. I mean, Rumi had a wife, he had family, he had a school, he had 4 teaching posts in different colleges. And one of the first things he does with Shams is disappear for 3 months in solitude. And so this left this meant that no one in town liked him because he was disrupting their lives. But there was something, as I said, galvanizing about Shams in that way. And he would, it's almost like the tales of Zen masters. You know, he would try to shock Rumi in certain ways and tell him to throw away his books and tell him to go to the tavern and carry a bottle of wine back through town, which of course is forbidden in religious law. So he was always sort of moving him, and to give up, in a certain way, had to give up his dignity, because he was a respected leader. So he really shook things up, and he shook things up in the direction that I talked about, which is towards poetry and song and dance and Sufi mystical senses of Islam. And then as now, these issues were contested. You know, so there were definitely, I mean, there were fatwas against Rumi in his lifetime for using music and dance in spiritual practice. I mean, there was a conflict between a more fundamentalist interpretation of Islam and a more Sufi interpretation of Islam, and Rumi was in the middle of that. But I think that would be the main teaching sense of Shams. They certainly loved each other in some way. I mean, it was sort of for both of them, no one had ever understood them almost. And in some way, Rumi saw Shams in this way that he had always felt about himself, I guess you would say, and Shams saw Rumi as a poet and a great mystic, and he helped Rumi come to accept that part of himself. So they were very necessary for each other. Yeah. And finally, and Shams would talk about this separation as a lesson in a way. I mean, when Shams disappears, Rumi suffers, and out of this suffering, he comes to a kind of enlightenment, and he comes to be a great poet simultaneously.
Yeah. On the theme of separation from the relationship of Shams, which you make the very nice point that Rumi found other companions after Shams goes that fulfilled the same role. That was interesting. The other really beautiful thing, and we take this up in our film, Lamya's poem, is the motif of the reed flute. Mm-hmm. And I was struck when I read that one rumor has it that the reed flute was actually brought by Rumi's family into that region. Mm-hmm. And that the whole notion of the reed flute was a type of transportation of secrets, you know, mm-hmm. And even the song of separation. So you sort of see in the reed flute the theme of separation combined with the theme of the secret. And there's all of this beautiful, in the Masnavi, there's so much on it. Yeah, so.
I mean, also Konya was basically a Christian town, and basically Greek, under control of the Turkic Seljuk Muslim rulers, right? So it was a mixed town, and that same story about the flute was part of Greek mythology too, where the flute tells the king's secret that he had whispered to the flute, and then the flute sings it, and that becomes in the Masnavi this kind of great masterwork of the later years of Rumi. You know, begins with that. Listen to the reed flute and the tale that it tells, how it sings of separation. So all of that is there, and for Rumi, this idea of separation again is partly human. It's where did Shams go? Where did my beloved go? It's a poem that he wrote, and it's also though about the human condition, and that there's somehow separation from love, separation from God is part of the human condition, and you're trying to get back to this sense of unity, which comes at times and fitfully and in glimpses.
it's amazing to see. It's
Um,
amazing to see the synthesis of Rumi's life after Shams is gone from his life, because he becomes exactly what his father wanted him to be. He becomes what his followers want him to be, which is there for them. He becomes what the town of Konya wants him to be, which is he's with everyone.
mhm.
And you have all of these stories of how he saves a Christian. You know, he speaks openly to anyone that comes through, irrespective of their place within society. And so it's and then of course he's writing the Masnavi. So tell us a little bit about this book, which is the most important book by Rumi. It's a commentary on the Quran. Is how we learn of this book, and it's something which was memorized after his death by Muslim culture all around the world.
Mhm.
So how did it originate, the Masnavi?
Well, the actual origin of the poem, I mean, in terms of Rumi's poetry, a lot of the ghazal and a lot of the love poems and some of the poems of torture in some way, and the pain of love, and a lot of that was written in the period after Shams's departure. And then at a certain point, when he was in Damascus searching for Shams for a while, he has this what seems like a moment of enlightenment where he said, well, why am I searching for him? He's inside of me. I've been searching for myself. So the sense is somehow that 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 what he learned from Shams is within himself. And even in those poems, he started using, in Persian poetry, there's the convention of a takalos, where the poet puts his name sometimes in the last line. And a lot of these names are poet names like Hafez or Attar, seller of perfumes, are sort of made up. And then, but Rumi doesn't use his own name; he uses Shams Tabrizi in the last, often in the last line. So he's sort of saying, "I'm not writing these poems. That Shams is writing these poems, right? Or love itself is writing these poems." And after Rumi's death, when they were originally collected, they were called the Collected Poems of Shams Tabrizi.
Mm.
So there's that sense, and it lasts in a different way than in the Masnavi. So at that point, he has then students of his own now, and he's teaching a much more mystical practice using whirling and poetry. And he has his closest figure, Hosamuddin, who's now younger than he is writing down the Masnavi. And supposedly Hosamuddin goes to Rumi at a certain point and says, why don't you write a Masnavi, which is a kind of spiritual teaching poem for your students, because they seem to like reading poetry more than these Sufi manuals. And then Rumi says, well, I was just thinking of that, and takes out of his turban the first 18 lines of the Masnavi, which I mentioned at the beginning about the Reed Flute. And this is very much, I mean, this is different than the passionate ghazal. It's really meant, these are stories, it's meant to teach, it's kind of rhymed, simple in a way poem. But when you learn more about Shams and read more of there are also notes about Shams's talks and things, you find that a lot of these stories were told to Rumi originally by Shams.
Huh.
And that even the Masnavi, in some sense, is keeping him in touch with what he had learned and passing it on.
We're going to open up to the audience shortly, so we encourage everybody to ask any question of Brad. We're very grateful, Brad, that you're with us. Finally, can you just sort of tell us a little bit? I mean, we're looking at a situation in the United States of unrest, of much of which is very justified, and absolutely, racial tensions are, all 50 states, we have uprisings.
Mm-hmm.
And reading this book, I'm recognizing that Rumi travels away from the most horrific genocidal violence. The empire, the Seljuk Empire that he's then in, is also dealing with an onslaught of the Mongol invasion. You talk about the fall of Baghdad to the Mongols. And then there was the Crusades. We just made a film on the Crusades, and it was at the same time the Fifth Crusade was happening right there. In fact, Al-Muazzam was the brother of Al-Kamil, and he ruled up in the north. So, you know, Rumi would pass through that experience as well. So what was the political and social context like for Rumi? And is it at all similar to our own in some way?
I think similar, worse. I mean, when you think, when you get into what Rumi's life, what was going on in history, in his time, we can at least feel we're not there yet. I mean, since the whole civilization of his boyhood and childhood was wiped out by the Mongols, and then the second wave by Genghis Khan's grandchildren, which destroyed Baghdad, and the killing of the caliph, putting him in a sack and having him trampled by horses. And all of this was really felt by people to be if not the end of the world, the end of Islam. I mean, there was really a feeling that the religion wasn't going to survive. So Rumi was living in, and as we said, I mean, traveled 2,500 miles, lived as a refugee, basically his entire life, and entire adult life. So this was a very difficult time. Interestingly for me, and I mentioned it a little in passing in the beginning, is how Rumi in this book kept dragging me into contemporary issues as well. And I mean, the pub date of this book was 2 days away from the inauguration of the current president, and the main news that January was the Muslim ban. And I was sort of going out talking about how America's favorite poet was Muslim, and not simply Muslim, but someone who's one of his main messages. I mean, he said, whether he's Turk or Tajik, I'm close to him. I mean, Rumi's message was always about unity. And then we're living so much in a time of divisiveness that the poetry can really speak to this moment.
It's interesting for our film. I don't know if Alex on our team mentioned this to you in your correspondence with him, but we found several stories of Syrian refugee youth turning to the poetry of Rumi to deal with trauma and things like, you know, human separation. So, you know, all of that's very real today, and people in throughout the world are turning to Rumi amidst social upheaval, and that's actually the theme.
I mean, when I said we're not there yet, Syria is there, I think, in a way. I mean, that level of destruction is close to what we saw at points with Genghis Khan, I think.
Yeah, and your book really, this is such an excellent book, and I really encourage everybody listening to purchase it. I learned so much about Islam. I mean, as Karen Armstrong gave a wonderful quote about the book, and I totally agree with her after finishing it, which is, this is a book which really shows the depth, the spiritual depth and context of Islamic civilization that Rumi was coming from. One other thing I neglected to mention was that the land where Rumi was born was a respected center of Islamic learning in its own right, even in other parts of what we would normally consider, you know, the capitals of Islam. So I found that very powerful, that you had so many Silk Road, Samarkandi theologians and poets and scholars, that Rumi being from there, I mean, Attar was one of Rumi's favorite influences as a young boy. I didn't realize that.
Mm-hmm.
And that they may, did you say that they may have met? They were certainly.
Yeah, I mean, similar to the story of Ibn Arabi, there's a story that in Nishapur, that Rumi and his father met Attar, and that Attar gave him his book of secrets.
Right.
Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. It certainly shows the influence. I mean, Rumi was looking towards certain spiritual poets for the model of what he was doing and you know, what he's stands for.
Yeah. Shaista, I want to turn it over to you. Maybe you could start, Shaista, with your own comments or questions for Brad, and then we can turn to the audience Q&A, please.
Absolutely fascinating, Brad. You've got a fan now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're smiling face there while we're talking.
There you go. Rumi's poetry. I mean, I find what little knowledge I have. It's very deep rooted. It's the poetry of love and spirituality. But I love the way it's touched the minds and hearts globally. But for a person who doesn't know too much about Rumi, why is he so important? If you could help me there.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I mean, I think he's important because people read him, and why do people read him is an interesting question. I mean, because as you were saying, that period there were. I mean, Rumi was one of many in a sense. There were Sufi poets, and there were also Sufi thinkers. So it was a whole world in which this work made sense. A lot of these images of the candle reflected in the mirror, the beloved being the mirror. This was in many people's poems, and it's just interesting that Rumi kept being found in a sense. I mean, he was preserved by the Mevlevi order, and then in Europe, suddenly he was picked up by people translating in German, and in America, he was picked up by Emerson, and who did a translation of Rumi, and now again, we have everyone reading Rumi. And I think, you know, part of it you just have to say is that he articulates the voice of one soul speaking, and he's, you know, he's very sincere about it, and that voice is what kind of grabs people.
I think so. Thank you for that. And we have a few other excellent questions. Mitchell is asking, I always wondered to what extent is Sufism accepted by Islam? Would you be able to touch upon that?
Yeah, I mentioned a bit. I mean, that it's still contested. You know, it's contested in our time. There's certainly been attacks on Sufi shrines and in the Middle East, and you know, these issues that Rumi contended with have always been live issues. At the same time, Sufism has been in Islam pretty much from the beginning, if not from the beginning, and certainly in Baghdad was an early center of Sufi thinkers. And, you know, it's basically an emphasis. It's not a different understanding of the theology or message of Islam. But, you know, in reading the Quran, then there's certain passages that appeal more to Sufis, like I'm closer to you than your jugular, and, you know, verses that emphasize the intimacy with God more than the hierarchy, for instance, and also that see poetry, music, dance as part of the spiritual practice, you know, as opposed to other emphases that only direct Quranic recitation is the only music that should be allowed. So, but it's not about, there doesn't seem to be really disagreement about theology almost. There's just the emphasis about how close how close the human and the divine can be, or allowed to be, almost.
Right.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Another question from Nazli in New York is the book written in chronological order, or does it highlight certain aspects of Rumi's life?
No, it's written in chronological order. I mean, I definitely wanted it to be a traditional biography in that sense. I mean, to follow him from birth until death, because I wanted the person of Rumi to come through, and the sort of ideas and even the poems to be understood in terms of what he went through. And so if you follow young Rumi going on this 2,500-mile journey and having to stop every night at caravanserai or inns that have been built on the Silk Road on the way, then all his poems about life being like an inn, and you need, you know, all the sort of freedom, in a way, a non-attachment that is in those poems makes sense, I think, when you know his life. And certainly you have to understand Shams, and I wanted it to be the real Shams, and you know, so that, you know, exactly what that chemistry, the spiritual chemistry was.
Great, and we have one last question. It's from Michael Wolf, and the question is, how has the work and story of Rumi stayed with you in your life, and what are you working on now? He's asked that.
Well, I'm still, I mean, this morning I was talking to a high school class of juniors at the Clinton School on Zoom school in Manhattan. So, I mean, in one way, Rumi stayed with me because people don't want to let go of Rumi. I mean, I talk about him, and you know, it was, I would say, transformative to write about Rumi. I mean, because he was such a he had such a large life, and he had such a large soul, and so it sort of required a kind of stretch, I think, and I think that I was changed by trying to be up to the task, you know, for a while. And now I'm writing it different in some ways. I'm writing a biography of the artist Keith Haring, and so it's a different figure and book than Rumi, but.
And people are not getting enough of you, and they're sending more questions. We have
we have time. Okay. We have time, Shaista. We have about
time.
6 minutes, okay. So you can feel free to go. Continue.
Thank you. And so, so Brad Kashif is asking, what's the nature of hate in Rumi's time that he felt the need to counter? That he felt the need to counter it with his love poetry.
Ah, well. I mean, it was coming from all directions, as in our time. That's a similarity. So, I mean, he was experiencing it politically, right? So the hatred of the Mongols to destroy these cities and kill all these people. When when Rumi and his family left, they left behind Rumi's grandmother and certain family members. I mean, everyone didn't come with them, and that was, you know, probably the last they ever heard of them. So there was that kind of hatred that he was experiencing firsthand. But there, you know, there was also, when I was talking about the tensions within Islam, you know, that there was anger at him in his lifetime. I mean, he was a beloved figure around Konya, and he got away with more than most probably would. But it was definitely, there was definitely struggle, and Shams, who we're talking about, was the great lightning rod for everybody's hatred, in a way. I mean, he wasn't such a lovable figure, and they resented him, and you know, and Rumi saw, there were rumors that Shams had been murdered, and that was the disappearance. I mean, it doesn't seem to be true, but there's always a possibility of that happening. I mean, there was that much animosity. Shams would go through town and people would show their daggers and things. So he definitely saw hate. And it's interesting that, I mean, in this period of more political turmoil than most periods, it was also a great period of enlightenment in poetry and religious thought and Sufism at that same moment. So the two were this kind of centripetal force. And, you know, Rumi, we know what side he was on. And that was focusing on love and unity.
There's Ashraf, and he's maybe it's linked to this. He's asking, Iranian consider Masnavi as a holy book. Is it in place of the Quran or beside it? Did he read prayers, keep fast, or other rituals of Islam? How did the dervish dance start? So he's got quite a few questions there.
So, I mean, Rumi very much was coming out. If you read the Masnavi, there are over 500 quotations from the Quran, and the book switches, as do the Ghazal, between Persian and Arabic at points. Fatemeh Keshwaris, who's a great Rumi scholar, said that it's very likely that Rumi had memorized the entire Quran because of the way that he can organically bring it in to his poetry. And he also he did the prayers. He was very much Muslim in that way, and loved fasting. Ramadan was his favorite time of year, and Rumi was always fasting. I mean, he had an extremely so. So that was a practice that he was very based in. At the same time, there are moments in the Masnavi where Rumi, being Rumi, skirts the edges of how far can you go with this, because you do get the sense that he thought that inspired poetry was at least very similar to inspired scripture. And so there's a moment in the Masnavi where he starts saying, people are criticizing the Masnavi because it's being written over then a couple of decades, it's being read aloud, people are talking about it, and he's, people are saying, oh, it's just a book of stories, and he said, well, they said the same thing about the Quran. So in there you get sort of, so is he comparing his poem to the Quran? And not exactly, but he's playing with this way in which heightened poetry can be a medium for messages about divine matters. So.
Thank you. I think we'll take it away there. Daniel, what do you think? Thank you, Brad, for that.
Yes, a virtual round of applause.
Okay, thank you.
Everyone at home can clap and thank Brad for joining us and for your really generous answers. I learned so much reading this book. It's as somebody who's an interfaith activist and very much involved in anti-Islamophobia work, Rumi comes up a lot. Mm-hmm. And in our film, somebody's actually asked about our film. It will be available maybe in a few months. Check our website, upf.tv. In the meantime, we'll be doing these events with scholars and more entertainment-based activities. So if you go to upf.tv and click on Enrichment, about twice a week we'll have webinars. And tonight's webinar will be archived on YouTube, so folks can tune in later. And again, thank you very much, Brad. We hope to meet with you again once all of this is over and we can shake your hand and be with you in the flesh. But in the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, and keep up the good work.
Same to all of you. And I mean, it was really a great pleasure to be here.
Pleasure's ours. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Till next time.
Thank you, Shaista.